In the hushed stillness before dawn, as Florence slept beneath a lavender sky, a soft clatter echoed down a narrow alley, the rhythmic clack of a loom hidden behind an old wooden door. Inside that humble room, by the flicker of a tallow candle, sat a girl named Livia. She was no noblewoman, no daughter of great guilds. She was just a weaver's orphan, her hands worn smooth from thread, her back bent before its time. But her fingers moved with grace, weaving not just silk, but stories. Florence in 1328 was a city of splendor and sorrow, gold and dust, while palaces soared, beggars still lined the bridges, and in a forgotten corner of the weaver's quarter, Livia's life stitched quietly between hunger and hope. Her father had once been a celebrated craftsman, renowned for patterns so intricate they seemed to breathe. But after his mysterious death during the guild riots, the workshop faded into shadow. Livia, only 9 then, was left with a loom and silence. Yet the city remembered. A traveling cloth merchant from Pisa once leaned into the doorway and whispered, "Your hands have your father's fire. Do you dream and thread?" She had nodded, but spoken nothing. Livia's secret was in the colors. She dyed her own thread using crushed berries and strange herbs whispered to her by her grandmother, once a spinner of folk spells. Her blues shimmered like midnight, her golds like the breath of dawn. Still, the Guild of Wool Merchants, the Arte della Lana, would never notice a weaver girl from Via dei Tessiadori. They cared for names, for legacies, not for silence and shadow. But then came the cloth fair of San Giovanni. Held once a year on the feast of Florence's patron saint, the city turned into a marketplace of wonder. Rich merchants, guild masters, and even Venetian buyers arrived to witness the year's best craftsmanship. It was Livia's one chance. She worked silently for weeks, not just on cloth, but on a tapestry. It showed the city itself. Florence, not in marble and tower, but as a mother cradling its people. The bridges formed her arms, the Duomo her heart. And in tiny stitches, Livia had sewn faces, tired, joyful, angry, dreaming, all those the city overlooked. She wept as she wove. She smiled too. It was all in the thread. The day of the fair arrived. The streets were a sea of color and clamor. Oranges from Sicily, carpets from the east, candles shaped like angels. But in a quiet corner booth, barely noticed, hung Livia's tapestry. Hours passed. No one looked. Then, as the sun dipped low, a boy with mismatched shoes stood before it. His mouth parted, his breath caught. He turned and ran, weaving through the crowd toward the guild pavilion. And moments later, a tall man in velvet robes stepped before the tapestry. Master Tommaso Benedetti, head of the Wool Guild. He said nothing, only stared. Then, quietly, he turned to Livia. "Who are you?" She looked up, trembling. "No one, sir. Just the weaver." He nodded. "Then Florence has forgotten her best artist." The guild master's gaze lingered on the tapestry for what felt like an eternity. Livia, still seated on her worn stool, tried to quiet the storm within her. Her fingers trembled in her lap, her breath shallow, like a bird caught in a closed room. Tommaso Benedetti stepped closer. He didn't speak of technique or fabric weight or market value. He simply said in a voice like the rustle of old parchment, "Only someone who has truly watched Florence could have stitched this." Livia nodded slightly. Her lips parted, but words didn't come. She wasn't used to speaking. Her language lived in warp and weft, in the flicker of candlelight on silk. Behind him, a few other guild masters had wandered close. One adjusted his spectacles. Another leaned in and traced the edge of the tapestry's threadwork with reverent fingers, never touching, just following the pattern. "It's alive," one of them murmured. Benedetti turned back to her. "Child, your work belongs in the guild hall, not in a forgotten alley." Livia shook her head. "I'm not of any family. My father," her voice cracked, "he was Maestro Elario, but after the riots," the guild master's brows furrowed. "Elario? The artisan of air?" That had been her father's title, earned for his delicate thread that danced like breath on wind. "We believed him dead," Benedetti whispered, "lost in the wool riots, and now here you are." He stood tall. "You'll bring your work to the Palazzo dei Tessitori tomorrow. The guild will decide where such hands belong." For the first time in years, Livia felt seen. That night, she walked home through the lantern-lit alleys of Florence. Her tapestry rolled beneath one arm, and her heart strange and full. But Not everyone rejoiced. From a dark archway, a pair of narrowed eyes followed her. Guartiero, a guild weaver bitter with pride, who had once tried and failed to mimic her father's lost technique. He would not let a girl, an orphan, rise above him. He had plans. The next morning, the Palazzo dei Tessitori buzzed with quiet awe. Merchants, nobles, and fellow weavers gathered, drawn by whispered rumors of the girl who weaves like Florence breathes. Livia stood in the great hall under a high arched ceiling painted with wool, sheep, and golden thread motifs. Her tapestry was unrolled, hanging tall behind her, the faces of Florence watching. Gasps filled the chamber. A boy pulled at his mother's skirt and pointed. An old man began to cry softly. "That's my street. That's my cat. She stitched my little shop." And among them, Benedetti simply nodded. The vote is unanimous. She is to be named a master weaver under the forgotten line of Eladio. The hall erupted with applause, with murmurs, with joy. But behind a curtain, Guartiero's jaw clenched. He had something that would ruin her. A piece of her thread found, copied, and now cursed. That night, Livia returned to her workshop. The air was soft. The stars above the terracotta rooftops twinkled like the beads on her old sewing box. She sat by the window and wept, but not from sadness, from release. Her father's name would live again. She whispered into the dark, "Papa, I did it." A breeze lifted through the window, and for just a moment the candle flame danced without wind. She smiled. She didn't see the shadow slipping through the alley outside. Florence awoke beneath a lavender dawn. Church bells tolled faintly in the hills, and the merchants on the Arno were already raising their awnings. But in a shadowed corner of Via della Lana, Livia sat over a new piece of linen, and something felt wrong. Her fingers, usually confident, stumbled. The thread snagged. The needle trembled in her hand. She blamed the nerves, or the joy, or the storm of emotions she hadn't yet had time to name. But the truth, hid in the spindle Gualtero had swapped. A single cursed thread, coated in a rare oil that weakened fibers. A secret tool once banned by the guild, rediscovered by jealous hands. As Livia stitched, that corrupted thread began to unravel her tapestry from within. invisibly, like a lie too small to notice at first. That afternoon, she visited Benedetti in the guild hall. He greeted her warmly. "The city's buzzing about you. One merchant offered to hang your tapestry in the Duomo." Livia flushed with pride, but then paused. "There's something strange in my stitching today." He frowned. "May I see it?" She unrolled the linen. To any eye, it was flawless, a sketch of the Ponte Vecchio at dusk, shimmering in thread. But to her, she could feel the tension. Benedetti nodded slowly. "It's not you. The thread feels wrong. Where did you get this spool?" Livia blinked. "It was in my kit. I don't know." And that's when it began. Words spread like wildfire. "The girl's thread has snapped. She cannot weave without her father's ghost. A trickster, a faker." Gualtero watched the whispers grow like rot beneath a fine tapestry. He planted rumors in taverns, in markets, in letters slipped to rivals. Even the guild council, once glowing with praise, began to murmur. Livia noticed it in their eyes, a soft pulling away, like a thread being unspooled. Even Benedetti seemed colder, distracted. One night, she sat by her window, staring at her calloused hands. Rain whispered against the tiled roof. Her cat, Minna, curled at her feet. And suddenly, she whispered, "Papa, I need your help again." The wind shifted. From her old sewing box, the one her father had carved, a tiny drawer slid open on its own. Inside was a single golden needle, her father's. She lit a candle, sat before her ruined tapestry, and threaded the needle with her last good spool, and began again. But this time, each stitch sang. The pattern wove a storm over Florence, a guild meeting under moonlight, a shadowy figure switching threads. The truth, stitched in. By morning, Livia hadn't slept. Her hands ached, her eyes burned. But the tapestry had grown, and in its growing, it whispered truths. The Ponte Vecchio still shimmered at its center, but now, beneath its arches, subtle figures emerged. A shadowy man passing a thread spool, another whispering to a merchant. A circle of men under torchlight judging, plotting, weaving their own lies. She had stitched the unseen. She had sewn the silence into light. Florence woke to its usual chorus, clanging church bells, shouting fishmongers, horses clattering on cobblestones. But within the guild hall, tensions stirred. Benedetti, torn between loyalty and suspicion, stood over a letter he'd found slid beneath his door. She used forbidden oils. She deceived the guild. Her fame is false. And beneath the words, a golden seal. Gualtiero's. That afternoon, Livia stepped into the piazza, carrying the tapestry under a veil of linen. The market fell silent. Whispers curled like smoke. She's come to defend herself. She's desperate. She'll fail. At the guild steps, Benedetti stood waiting. Gualtiero, too, arms folded smugly. Livia unwrapped the cloth, hung it before the crowd, and stepped back. Sunlight kissed the thread, and the story unfolded. They gasped. What is this? Is that the council? That man, that's Gualtiero. Each figure, though stylized, matched a real face, a moment, a crime. It was not just art. It was evidence. Benedetti turned to Gualtiero, eyes blazing. You tried to ruin her with poison thread, with lies. Gualtiero stammered. It's symbolic, a dream. She cannot prove. But Livia stepped forward, holding her father's golden needle. This, she said softly, was once given to a man who believed thread could carry truth. He taught me to see what others miss. Then she opened her box, revealing the cursed spool. It still glistened faintly with oil. A weaver in the crowd murmured, I know that smell. That's oak lanolin. It frays linen in moonlight. A murmur of rage passed through the crowd. Gualtiero's fate was sealed. That night, Livia walked alone across the Arno Bridge. The tapestry had been accepted as both artwork and testimony. She'd been offered a position, Master Weaver, the youngest in guild history. But she turned it down. She didn't want titles. She wanted to remember why she'd started. Back in her workshop, she unfurled a fresh canvas. This one would not be for Florence. not for guilds, not for markets. It would be for her father. She dipped her needle into golden thread and began to stitch a sky full of stars, a daughter's hands, and the ghost of a man smiling. Long after the crowd had faded, the guild had quieted, and Florence resumed its breathless rhythm. Livia sat in her workshop, alone but at peace. The loom was silent tonight. No thread hummed, no needle tapped. Only the soft whisper of candlelight flickered against the walls, dancing shadows upon her half-finished tapestry. She thought of her father, of the night he gave her that golden needle, whispering, "Truth can be woven if your hands are brave enough." But she also thought of the weavers she'd met, voices long silenced under guild laws, and the secrets still buried beneath Florence's golden face. And so she wrote a letter to Lucca, to Siena, to Venice. History of voices. She sealed each parchment with wax, not a noble's seal, not a guild crest, but the symbol she now used, a simple spool, thread unraveling into a star. 2 weeks later, a rider from Lucca arrived at dawn, dusty, hungry, but holding a woven patch in his hands. He said, "From Master Clara. She sends her stitch." It was a fragment of cloth, a garden of scarlet roses stitched over gray thread. A note attached. "They tried to silence me with thorns, but I bled beauty." Livia wept, not from sadness, from belonging. Soon more came. From Bergamo, from Pisa, even from a small village outside Milan. Each carried a patch. Each told a story, some of hunger, some of courage, some of forgotten names. Grandmothers who had once dyed fabric in rivers under moonlight. Livia gathered them carefully, and night after night she began stitching them together, not into a tapestry, but a cloak of voices. Then came the day word arrived from Rome. An invitation, no, a summons. The papal court wished to see the tapestry, not the one that unmasked Gualtiero, but this one, the cloak of forgotten weavers. The stories stitched into silence. Her journey to Rome began under a cloudless sky. Florence faded behind her. The scent of saffron and smoke gave way to olive groves, warm fields, and the hush of the countryside. Livia rode beside wagons of thread and cloth. Women sang lullabies in dialects older than books. One elderly weaver told tales of threads dyed with crushed beetles, a method from the Moors. And in every stitch there was history. In every hand, memory. When she arrived at the papal gates, she did not bow. She stood tall, cloak across her shoulders, needle tucked in her braid. She said, "I bring no plea, only proof." The hall of the papal palace in Rome was quiet, but not still. Torches hissed softly on the stone walls. Sunlight filtered through high stained glass windows, casting pools of color onto the marble floors. And at the far end, seated beneath an arch of gold and ivory, waited the Holy See's council. They had summoned merchants, they had summoned bishops, but never a weaver, and certainly not one wearing a cloak stitched from rebel threads. Livia stepped forward, not with fear, but with focus. Each step echoed. Behind her, her companions, silent and watchful. An elderly Moorish dyer from Palermo, a spinner from the Alps with a spindle of bone, a boy no older than 10, who embroidered to survive after war took his village. They carried no banners. Their proof was their presence and the cloak. A cardinal rose. "This cloak," he said softly, "is not from the guilds." Livia nodded. "No, it is from the hands they refused to see." Another elder priest stepped forward. He touched the cloak gently. "These stitches, they tell stories." "They are stories," she replied. Every piece was woven by one who had been silenced. This, she raised a patch showing faded red poppies, is from a woman who dyed her threads with berries because she could afford nothing else. She called it her hunger red. The council murmured. One bishop, skeptical, asked, "And what is your intent, child? Revolution?" "No," Livia said. "Recognition. Not just of my hands, but of theirs." She pointed behind her, to the group of weavers, to the widows who mend without name, to the girls who embroider by candlelight to feed their brothers, to the men forced to hide their art because it did not fit into guild rule. I bring not rebellion, I bring the truth of thread. And then silence, not stiff or suspicious, but soft, like the hush before a curtain rises. Then the oldest voice in the room, a scholar in deep blue, leaned forward. "Child," he said, "would you share the story of your cloak?" And so she did. She told them about Florence, about Gualtiero's deception, about the women whose ideas were stolen, whose names were erased, about the tapestry that unmasked corruption, and about a needle passed from a dying father, stitched more than cloth. It stitched a legacy. And as she spoke, the court, for once, listened. That evening, the council made no declaration. No law was passed. No formal decree made. But as she left the hall, one quiet papal scribe followed her into the courtyard. He held out a small box. Inside, a single thread, pure white, embroidered with golden ink. Veritas in filis. Truth and thread. When she returned to Florence, people were waiting. Not just weavers, but mothers, scribes, musicians, anyone who had once felt their work ignored because it was humble or handmade or poor. The cloak of voices was now a banner, and it no longer needed permission to be seen. The tale of the Weaver Girl of Florence did not end at the papal palace. No, it had just begun. Word spread not by trumpet nor proclamation, but by whispers carried on spinning wheels, on letters tucked into bundles of linen, on songs hummed by seamstresses late at night. They called it Il filo della verità, the thread of truth. And slowly it began to stitch Europe together, one hidden corner at a time. In a windswept village near the coast of Brittany, an aging lacemaker heard Livia's story from a traveling merchant. That night, she embroidered her signature for the first time, a small spiral tucked into the edge of a collar. In Seville, a young boy whose hands were burned by dye vats began to secretly teach color theory to other children in chalk on alley walls. He traced the tale of the Florence cloak in quiet pigment circles. In Prague, 3 sisters opened a thread room, not a shop, but a sanctuary where anyone could mend in silence and dignity, no matter their class. Livia herself stayed humble. She returned to the village near the Honor River where her father once raised sheep. She bought a small cottage and a loom. Children came to learn. Old weavers came to unburden their secrets. She would say, "Tell me the thread that tells the truth, and I'll show you hands that remember." But not everyone was pleased. In Venice, guilds grew nervous. In Bruges, merchants whispered that this cloak girl was turning needles into weapons. In Florence itself, the fabric houses began branding their garments with golden thread seals, trying to silence the memory of a girl who once walked barefoot to the city gates. Still, the thread moved, not with rebellion, but with remembrance. One night, a dusty traveler knocked at Livia's door. He was from York, a cobbler by trade. He held out a small pouch. Inside, a fragment of her cloak. He said softly, "Traveled all the way. My wife heard the tale in a spice shop in Cairo. Said to return it to the girl who gave us back our stitches." That night, Livia sat by the fire. She turned the fragment over in her hands. It was frayed, yes, and travel-worn, but still vibrant, still whole. A thread once buried, now wrapped around the world. She smiled and whispered, "Needles don't draw blood when they mend." By the time spring returned to Tuscany, Livia's thread had woven itself into more than cloth. It had become a quiet revolution, not of fire and steel, but of needle and soul. The people did not chant her name in the streets, but in taverns, inns, and wash houses, they whispered of the girl who mended with truth. In a bustling port in Marseille, a merchant noticed a change. His fabrics now bore tiny signatures stitched inside hems. When asked, the weavers said nothing, but their eyes glimmered with quiet defiance. In Krakow, the daughter of a nobleman removed her gloves and taught peasant girls how to embroider using silks. She called it the thread circle. In Constantinople, a scholar found Livia's tale copied in the margin of a Byzantine medical scroll, next to an old monk's note, "Wounds of the body mend with herbs. Wounds of the people mend with hands." Back in Florence, however, silence grew heavy. The guilds, still proud and powerful, could not silence the people, but they could isolate her. They forbade merchants from buying threads spun in her village. They posted guards at the city gate. They called it protecting the tradition. Livia did not resist. She did not plead. Instead, she sent 12 cloaks, each dyed a different color, each stitched with the stories of a different forgotten worker, to 12 distant towns. She called them Capes of Memory. Each cloak carried a secret code in its weave and shade, a quiet map for the menders to find each other. A network of kindness was blooming, one thread at a time. And still she wove, her hands now older but steady, her back bent from years at the loom. Yet her eyes still held the fire of that first morning on the city steps. One evening, she sat by the fire. The cloak she once gifted to the Pope was returned to her, worn by a humble messenger. It has traveled far, and now it belongs where it began. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and in that moment, it was not a cloak. It was a memory, a map, a legacy. She closed her eyes and smiled. The wind carried whispers through Florence, but this time they did not speak of guilds or gold. They spoke of a weaver's hands, and how those hands had stitched something stronger than silk: remembrance. Livia's cottage, once hidden in a crooked alley, became a silent sanctuary. Not a museum, not a shrine, but a place where spindles still spun and the old wooden loom still sang. Children came first, barefoot, bright-eyed. They watched her move the shuttle back and forth. "Why do you do it so slowly?" one asked. And she smiled. "Because stories need time," she whispered, "or they'll unravel before they're heard." Then came mothers, fathers, former apprentices who once mocked her patience, now returned with thread in hand. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't need to. They came to learn how to listen to the cloth, to the past, and to each other. Livia taught them not only how to weave fabric, but how to read it. She showed them how every knot had a purpose, how every curve of color told something of the soul behind it. And slowly, like dawn peeling back night, a new guild was born. No coins exchanged hands, no masters stood above students. They called themselves the Thread Keepers. Elsewhere, rulers changed. Kings fell, borders shifted, wars flared and faded. But in Florence, under the hush of the hills, a quiet revolution endured, stitched into sleeves, shawls, and secret linings. In her final season, Livia wove a single length of cloth. It had no gold, no signature, no mark of status, only warmth, only care. It was wrapped around a child born on the winter solstice, a girl with eyes as deep as night, and a name whispered into the folds. It meant hope. Even centuries later, there are whispers in the fabric, not loud, not in books, but in the hush between stitches, in the fold of a hem, in the shimmer of thread against morning light. Some say Livia's loom was passed from hand to hand, never displayed, never sold, only kept quietly by those who understood. It was not her tools that lasted. It was the feeling. The silence before a thread is pulled taut. The intention in every knot. The care. In 1891, a forgotten bundle of linen was discovered in a sealed attic near the river Arno. The cloth bore no crest, no signature, only a single word embroidered faintly in golden brown. Spera. Textile scholars debated, but a young student from Florence simply whispered. It was hers. In modern Italy, among the rush of scooters and glass towers, a small shop remains tucked in a narrow lane. Its windows are fogged with scent of wool and beeswax. Above the door, a carved spindle, faded with time. Inside, a quiet hum, not of machines, but of hands weaving. The sign reads, Filo di Speranza, the thread of hope. Tourists often walk past it. Some enter. They find no flashy wares, no souvenirs, only cloth that feels warm in the palm, and a woman, or sometimes a man, who greets them with a smile as if they've always been expected. And if you ask about Livia, they won't tell you a tale. They'll hand you a needle and say, Sit, tell me your thread, because that is how her story lives on. Not in marble, not in museums, but in the simple act of teaching someone to mend, gently, lovingly, again and again. And as long as there are hands willing to weave with kindness instead of speed, she is never forgotten. And so, dear dreamer, let your mind rest in those narrow Italian alleys. Let the scent of lavender and aged wood lull you. Let the threads wrap you gently, reminding you that care never truly fades. Good night. Sleep softly, and remember, every thread tells a story, and tonight, one of them was yours.